Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Chinese economy. If you've been following the channel, you'll know that 2023 has been a very difficult year for China. At the start of the year, expectations were high because the restrictions relating to the COVID-19 pandemic had finally been released after 3 years of continued lockdowns. And the expectation was that the Chinese economy would return to full growth and would achieve somewhere around 7 or 8% growth for the full year. The Chinese economy did get off to a good start in January and February. However, since that time, things have slowed down considerably. And the expectations today are that China will be lucky to achieve 5% growth. And as we edge closer to the end of 2023, we are continuing to see bad news coming out from China. And the latest news relates to all of the property developers. Now, we've been talking about the property sector for a long period of time. The last 3 years have represented a downturn for China as a direct result of the 3 red lines policy that was brought in by the Chinese authorities to restrict the amount of debt that the developers could actually get their hands on. And the problem with that policy was that those developers were fully reliant on debt. They needed that debt to be able to fund the continued build of all of the apartment blocks. So the restriction of the debt led to a huge reduction in cash flow and development. And that's resulted in the majority of the Chinese property developers now either being in default or on the verge of default. And in today's episode, I want to give you an update as to what's happening with Evergrande, which is the most indebted company in the whole world, not just in China. It has over $340 billion worth of debt, which is an eye-watering figure. Now, Evergrande has been in default since 2021, but has been working on a restructuring program. However, it now looks unable to deliver that plan, and there is a very serious risk that the company may go into liquidation at some point in the near future. And if that does happen, it could be catastrophic for the Chinese economy. I'll also update you on Country Garden, which is the largest property developer in China, and prior to the last couple of months was seen as being immune to all of these problems. However, it recently missed a couple of bond coupon payments, and the company has now announced that it's on the verge of defaulting on its debt. So this is yet again another developer that's in a position where it can't repay its loans. And that will have consequences not just for the debt providers to the company, but also all of its customers who are waiting for the apartments to be completed. I'll then give an update on KAISA, which was actually the first of all of the Chinese developers to default on its debt back in 2021. And they've given an update as to what the likely returns to investors will be if the company does go into liquidation. And I can tell you the figures are very, very frightening. We'll then go on to have a look at some of the fundamental problems in the property sector. We'll share some data on what's going on. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months for these developers and what the implications are for the Chinese economy and also the global economy. Because let's not forget, China is the second largest economy in the world by some way. China and the USA are huge compared to all of the rest of the countries in the world. So if China is going into another slowdown, then that will have a knock-on impact to lots of other countries. But before we get started on all of that, if you'd like to support the channel and also see more content that I'm not posting on YouTube and also be able to avoid the adverts that you get on YouTube, then please check out my Patreon channel. However, if you don't like Patreon and you'd still like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to buymeacoffee.com as well as YouTube's Super Thanks and membership scheme. Evergrande is the world's most indebted company with over $340 billion worth of debt, and included in that total is $31.7 billion worth of offshore debt, which is basically bonds that have been issued to international holders. As soon as the Chinese authorities introduced the 3 red lines restriction on debt provided to Chinese property developers in August 2020, Evergrande was in serious trouble. Evergrande had been taking large deposits from customers in advance of building apartments, and it's reported that in 2021 Evergrande had taken payment for 1.6 million apartments that it was yet to build. The company subsequently defaulted on its debt obligations. However, the holders of the Chinese debt have not enforced on the company, and the international bondholders had to wait for a restructuring plan. That plan was finally put forward in March 2023, and under the 2 main options proposed, creditors could either swap all of their holdings into new notes with maturities of between 10 and 12 years, or convert them into different combinations of new notes of 5 to 9 years and equity-linked instruments. So the basic plan was to refinance and push out all of the maturity dates to between 5 and 12 years. At the time that the plan was released, Evergrande advised that a key bondholder group had agreed to the proposed terms. However, since the restructuring plan was announced, things have started to get worse for Evergrande. In August 2023, Evergrande announced that its trading losses for the first 6 months of the year were a whopping $4.53 billion. However, this was actually an improvement to the $9 billion that the company lost in the same period in 2022. And at the same time, the company announced that its combined losses for 2021 and 2022 were $81 billion. It lost $81 billion, an incredible amount. And in a press release, Evergrande said that its ability to continue trading would depend on a successful implementation of the offshore debt restructuring plan and successful negotiations with the rest of the lenders on repayment extensions. It was also announced at that time that Evergrande had filed for Chapter 15 bankruptcy protection, which allows a US bankruptcy court to step in when an insolvent case involves another country. Chapter 15 bankruptcy is intended to promote cooperation between US courts, debtors and other countries' courts involved in cross-border bankruptcy proceedings. So this action indicated that Evergrande was readying itself for the potential of a bankruptcy situation. In September, it was announced that the Evergrande chairman had been arrested and was being investigated on suspicion of transferring assets offshore. And this followed on from arrests that had been made at Evergrande's wealth management arm. Following on from these arrests, Evergrande announced that it was unable to issue new debt, as it could not meet the qualifications for the issuance of new notes. And as a direct result of that, the restructuring plan that had been put forward in March was unable to proceed. This latest development leaves Evergrande at risk of actually going into liquidation, and investors have warned that Evergrande could face an uncontrolled collapse that would be a disaster for China's property sector. Country Garden is by far the largest property developer in China in terms of the number of different projects that it's working on. And in August 2023, it shocked the market when it announced losses of $6.7 billion for the first half of 2023. And to put the size of Country Garden into perspective, it has 4 times the number of building projects underway as Evergrande does. In its filing to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, Country Garden said the shrinkage of the property sector, coupled with the not yet restored confidence of the capital market, exerted mounting pressure on the company's business operation. And it added that it would try its best to improve its operating cash flow by ensuring good sales performance, strive to revitalise underperforming assets, and reducing inessential administrative expenses. The earnings report came out as Country Garden was negotiating with creditors to reschedule debt repayments so as to avoid a default. The company was also proposing issuing new shares worth 255 million yuan. At the start of August, it was announced that Country Garden had missed interest payments on its bonds. However, there's a 30-day grace period in place, which allows the company a short period of time to make good those payments. However, Country Garden has now announced that it's unable to meet all of its offshore debt payments, and therefore also needs to go through a restructuring program. In a filing to the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, the company said it would not be able to meet all of its offshore payment obligations when due or within the relevant grace periods, and this puts the company at risk of creditors demanding payment acceleration or pursuing enforcement action. Country Garden, which has $10.96 billion worth of offshore bonds and $6 billion worth of offshore loans, said it was facing significant uncertainty regarding the disposal of assets, and its cash position remained under pressure. The developer said it had appointed Houlihan Lokey, China International Capital Corporation, and law firm Sidley Austin as advisors to examine its capital structure and liquidity position and formulate a holistic solution. The company added that it will work with advisors to develop the most pragmatic and optimal solution for all stakeholders, and called for patience from creditors. Morningstar analyst Jeff Zhang said mandating advisors showed whether the company will default hinges on the outcome of overseas debt restructuring, and the next 2 weeks will be critical. He went on to say that we do not expect Country Garden's liquidity to materially improve, as home buyers and financial institutions may continue to stay on the sidelines. Earlier this week, Country Garden was due to pay $66.8 million in coupons on 2024 and 2026 dollar bonds, although the payments do have a 30-day grace period. The company faces a big test next week when its entire offshore debt could be deemed in default if it fails to pay a $15 million September coupon by October the 17th, the end of the 30-day grace period. Sandra Chow, co-head of Asia Pacific Research at Creditors, said the company's previous model was not sustainable. They are now addressing it, trying to scale down their debt burden and make their business size appropriate. There is a smaller property market overall, and it makes sense to adapt to that, she said, adding that a restructuring would look to extend debt maturity repayments, reduce bond coupon rates, and accelerate asset sales. In 2021, KAISA became the first Chinese property developer to default on its offshore bond obligations, when it advised that it could no longer service its $12 billion worth of international bonds. The company had put forward a proposal to bondholders to avoid the default. However, it failed to secure a 95% approval level needed from all bondholders. Almost 2 years after that initial default, the bondholders are still waiting for KAISA to put forward a restructuring plan. And as a result, a winding up petition was filed by Broad Peak Investment in July 2023 in the Hong Kong High Court in relation to non-payment on onshore bonds worth 170 million yuan or $23.28 million. In response to this, KAISA have now advised a Hong Kong court that creditors will get back less than 5% of their money if it's forced into liquidation. At a court hearing on Tuesday the 10th of October, Barrister James Wood cited a statement that KAISA filed with the court saying recovery rate would be less than 5% in a liquidation scenario and its cash to short-term ratio is 0.02, which confirms that the company is cash flow insolvent. KAISA has applied to strike out the liquidation petition, with its lawyer arguing in court the bond contract is under mainland Chinese law and Broad Peak does not have the authority to commence a winding up procedure in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a special administrative region of China but maintains its own legal system. Judge Linda Chan gave the parties 28 days to provide new expert advice on whether the petitioner has authority to seek liquidation. She also asked KAISA to submit an update on its restructuring progress before the next hearing in a date to be decided later. With $12 billion of offshore debt, KAISA is China's largest issuer of offshore debt among developers after Evergrande. Now, as we discussed at the start of the video, the reason that these companies are making significant losses is partly down to what's happening in the sector. And these three charts show the property sales by floor area, the level of property investment, and funds raised by developers dating back to 1999. And what this shows is that between 1999 and 2007, there was healthy growth in property sales by floor area. There was then a fall in 2008 as a result of the global financial crisis. The market then bounced back significantly in 2009 and remained in the black until 2014 when there was another fall as a result of the dip that we saw in the global economy, which was partially caused by Russia's invasion of Crimea in that year. The market then returned back to healthy growth between 2015 and 2021. However, in 2022 and 2023, we have seen a major fall in property sales by floor area. If we now look at the level of property investment, it's interesting to note that between 1999 and 2021, there was a year-on-year increase in property investment. So we didn't see a big dip during the global financial crisis or the downturn in the global economy in 2014. There was continued investment into the sector. However, in 2022 and 2023, there has been an actual reduction in the level of investment into the sector in China. And it's a very similar story in terms of the funds raised by developers. Between 1999 and 2021, there was a large increase in the level of funds raised by developers. However, in the last 2 years, we have seen a complete reversal of that trend. And that's one of the reasons why these developers are now struggling, because they simply can't get their hands on the cash to continue trading. This chart illustrates how the fortunes of some of the largest property developers in China have changed dramatically over the course of the last 9 years. This chart shows the official net profit figure for the Country Garden dating back to 2015. And you can see that between 2015 and 2019, the company achieved year-on-year growth in profits. In 2015, it recorded a profit of around 8 billion Chinese yuan. And by 2019, that profit had risen to almost 40 billion Chinese yuan. The profit figure fell to around 35 billion in 2020, around 25 billion in 2021, and in 2022, Country Garden recorded a loss of around 5 billion yuan. However, the situation has got significantly worse in 2023, and so far this year, the company has recorded losses of almost 50 billion yuan. Sify Holdings is another large Chinese property developer, and you can see that in the period between 2015 and 2021, the company managed to increase its net profit. However, in 2022, it incurred its first loss, and that loss is continuing in 2023. Sonic China is one of China's biggest property developers, and between 2015 and 2020, it saw healthy growth in its net profit. However, in 2021, it recorded a loss of almost 40 billion yuan. Now, those losses have been reducing, but it's still incurring losses. And the final company on this chart is Evergrande. Between 2015 and 2018, Evergrande increased its net profit and achieved almost 40 billion of profit in 2018. That profit reduced to around 18 billion in 2019, around 5 billion in 2020, and in 2021, the company recorded a monumental loss. It continued to make significant losses in 2022 and is still making losses today. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video firstly to give you an update as to what's happening with Evergrande, Country Garden and KAISA, and also to look at what's going on in the Chinese property sector as a whole. Because as we've discussed before, this sector equates to around 25% of total Chinese GDP. And in fact, over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, it's been one of the big drivers of the growth of the Chinese economy. There was a property boom. People literally couldn't buy property quickly enough. They were sleeping in the streets when new property developments were being released to try to get their name at the top of that list to buy multiple apartments in many situations. But the problem with all of that boom was that it was fueled entirely by debt. And a lot of the property developers were basically over trading. They were agreeing to sell more apartments off plan than they had the cash to be able to build. So they were constantly having to borrow from the new deposits to fund some of the old builds. And as soon as the debt merry-go-round stopped when the 3 red lines was introduced, that caused major problems because they could no longer get their hands on large amounts of debt, and therefore they had to rely upon their own cash flow. And what most of these businesses found was that they simply didn't have enough cash flow to be able to keep paying all of their workers to simply finish all of the builds that they'd been paid for in advance. And that dynamic has had a devastating impact on the vast majority of these companies. Now, as we talked about in today's video, Evergrande and KAISA, which are the two companies that have the largest amount of offshore debt, so debt that's located outside of China. Evergrande has somewhere in the region of $32 billion worth of offshore debt, and KAISA has around $12 billion. Now, as we've talked about in today's video, Evergrande and KAISA have both been in default since 2021. And the reason that these two companies are important is that they have the largest amount of offshore debt, so debt that's located outside of China, bonds that are held by international finance businesses. And the reason that that's important is those companies are more likely to take action against Evergrande and KAISA than the Chinese banks. If a company that's borrowed money from a Chinese bank is in default, that Chinese bank will only take action and enforce against that company if the Chinese authorities say that it can do so. They won't allow a liquidation of a company if they don't believe that it's in the interests of the Chinese economy. However, when you're talking about international debt, obviously the Chinese authorities don't have any control against hedge funds and other institutions located in the USA and elsewhere around the world. And so those parties can actually take the company to court and try to recover the money they've lent to the company through some sort of bankruptcy process. So KAISA and Evergrande are really high profile because we can see what's happening. We get very limited data on the property developers that are not listed companies, so not floated on the stock markets, that have only got Chinese debt, because all of that's happening within the Chinese economy. But obviously we can follow what's going on with the international markets. Now, if Evergrande was a company that was headquartered and located in the USA, it would have actually gone through some form of insolvency process already. You can't be in default for 2 years and nothing happens in the USA, because bondholders will accelerate their positions and try to recover their money after the grace period. And generally speaking, on a bond, you have around 30-day grace period if you miss a payment, where you're allowed to make that good. Once that 30 days expires, then the bondholders can start some sort of proceedings against you. However, the problem that the bondholders have in this situation is that the vast majority of the assets for Evergrande are located in China. They only had a very small number of overseas developments and overseas assets, and most of those assets have already been seized and sold. So the high-profile ones are the Evergrande jet that was sold for around $100 million, and recently their super yacht was also sold for around $30 million, which is obviously a drop in the bucket compared to the $30 billion plus of overseas debt that they've got. So the international bondholders in this situation are in a very difficult situation, because firstly, there are very few assets they can actually seize to liquidate and pay themselves back. And secondly, the vast majority of Evergrande is operating under Chinese control. The bondholders don't have any leverage over the Chinese authorities to get them to put Evergrande into liquidation and distribute whatever cash is available after repayment of all of the debt. And of course, it's not just Evergrande. The same principles apply to Country Garden, KAISA, and all of the other Chinese property developers that have issued international debt. So you may be sitting there thinking, well, is any of this actually relevant? Is anything going to happen? Are these property developers going to fail? Are they going to go into liquidation? Or are things just going to carry on exactly as they have been for the last 2 years? And I think the news that we're seeing at the moment does represent a change of gear. Up until this stage, there hasn't really been any serious talk of Evergrande going into liquidation. It was expected that the restructuring plan that was put forward in March 2023 would be approved and we would just kick the can further down the road. So the bonds that are due for repayment now would all be refinanced, probably for another 5 or 10 years, and therefore the bondholders would just have to sit and wait for another 5 or 10 years before they could take more action. However, the recent arrest of both the chairman of Evergrande and also some of the staff from the wealth management division has put things into a slightly different perspective, because the company is no longer in a position to be able to issue new bonds. So it can't just kick the can down the road and issue another 10-year bond to replace the previous one, because the authorities have said they're not allowed to do that. So it looks like the Chinese authorities are actually closing the door on the potential of just letting things roll forever. So as it stands at the moment, it looks genuinely possible that Evergrande could actually go into liquidation. The company that was deemed to be too big to fail could actually fail. And the question is, what will happen in terms of the Chinese economy if it does go down that road? And I think the answer to that question is that this will be seriously bad news for China, because the $340 billion of debt, the majority of that, over $300 billion, is held by Chinese institutions, and they are very unlikely to get a big return on that money. As we saw from KAISA's press release, they're estimating that creditors would get a return of around 5% on their loans if KAISA is liquidated. Now, if we apply that sort of percentage to the Evergrande debt, that would mean that there'd only be around 15 to 20 billion to pay back the 340 billion. And that would be a serious loss for all of these institutions. And as we've talked about before, there is a domino effect here, because if financial institutions have to write off the full amount of their loans to Evergrande, that means that they will make less profit. They will therefore have less cash to be able to pay out in dividends or even to pay their staff. They may have to downsize, or possibly some of these financial institutions could actually find themselves in some sort of liquidation crisis, similar to what we saw in 2008. And if you apply that across the whole sector, if this is a new trend that the Chinese authorities are allowing these property development companies to actually go into liquidation, then there is a genuine risk that hundreds of billions of dollars of loans could be written off in China over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. And that would therefore have a devastating impact on the financial sector in China. And as the financial sector is funding a lot of industry, it would therefore have a knock-on impact to industry. So we would get a really vicious circle where there would be a contraction in the supply of money. Companies wouldn't be able to get their hands on enough capital, and we could see a serious slowdown, or potentially, in a worst case scenario, even a recession in China. So even though I've been talking about Evergrande for the last 2 years, I think the next 3 to 6 months are going to be the real focal point. We will see exactly what's going to happen, because if the Chinese authorities don't lift this ban on Evergrande being able to issue more debt, it's impossible for them to be able to restructure, and they will go into liquidation. So I'll keep you posted on any further news as and when it happens. Hopefully you found today's episode useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.